بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. So today we're going to talk about the things that invalidate the fast, and more specifically what we're required to do if we do break our fast during the month of Ramadan. So we won't be going necessarily as much into what happens if you decide to do a nafil fast and you break it, but essentially they amount to about the same things. So obviously all sane adult Muslims who do not meet certain categories of those who are exempt have to fast. And the things that will invalidate your fast, they can be divided into four things. Those that require a makeup as well as expiation, those that require a makeup but no expiation, and those that require nothing and are not disliked, as well as those that require nothing yet are disliked. So when we get into dislike, anything that's disliked, we're usually talking about things that it doesn't invalidate your fast, but you really shouldn't have done it. And then the things that are not disliked are their general actions. Like, for instance, if you're breathing, obviously that does not break your fast, or if you put perfume on it, wouldn't break your fast. So first we'll go with those that require a makeup as well as expiation. And we can generally start with that with if one were to eat or drink something of nutritional value. And it's key to mention nutritional value here because you often get the question about medicine, whether that falls into this category. And we'll come to that later on. But if you were to eat something that has nutritional value, if you have intercourse in either passage, any of the passages, on purpose. Now we say on purpose here because again, if you do something forgetfully, and we can cover forgetfully with that in a little bit. But if you were to, for instance, forget you were fasting and take a sip of water, or you were to forget you were fasting and eat, like you went and took a nap and you woke up, you forgot what you were doing, and you eat a drink. Okay, that was forgetful. You don't have to do an expiation in that case. Now, we also, and those are the things that you could do that would require expiation, right? So simply, if you eat or drink something, or you have intercourse, then on purpose, of course, those are the two things that generally require expiation. And when we talk about that, expiation can be done in three ways. One is to free a slave. That does not apply to anyone right now. I don't think anyone here has a slave that they could possibly free. Next, if you don't have one, you'd fast 2 consecutive months, right? 60 days. You cannot include Eid, you cannot include either of the Eids, you cannot include Ramadan or any other day that's obligatory to fast on. So you'd have to fast for 60 days. If you cannot fast for 60 days, then you would feed 60 poor people half of a sa of wheat. So a lot of times you'll hear this given as the amount that you would give for zakatul fitr, right? So depending on what it would cost to give someone, some would say $10 in this area in the United States, which is about right. So you might give $10 per person, right? So as you can see, if you end up paying $10 per person and you have to feed 60 poor people, that's about $600, right? Or if you take the lower amount and say $5, because you could technically buy a meal for $5, again, you're talking about $150 right there. So to go over that one more time, just because we've had a few more people join us, the four things we're going over is things that you do that require you to make up as well as an expiation, those that require make up without an expiation, those that require nothing and are not disliked, and those that are disliked but require nothing. If you eat or drink something, or if you intentionally have sexual intercourse, you're required to either free a slave, fast 2 consecutive months, and that cannot include either Eid. It also cannot include um, Ramadan itself. If you cannot fast 60 consecutive days or two consecutive months, 60 consecutive days, then you must feed 60 poor people, right? So that could be $5 a person or $10 a person. Talk with someone in your local area to find out what that actually is. Now, if you do one of the above, namely if you eat or drink or have intercourse out of forgetfulness, then you don't have to make up your fast or perform expiation, right? So you did it out of forgetfulness. And you often hear this sometimes, that if you drink a sip of water and you legitimately forgot you were fasting, and then you're like, oh no, I was fasting, that you don't make up your fast. You continue your day as if you were fasting. And you'll oftentimes hear people talk, and they'll say, like in Hadith literature, you'll see that, okay, that's simple. That was a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, basically, right? So you continue your fast because you did it forgetfully. This is only if you do it intentionally, right? And of course, when you look in books of fiqh, they're very clear to mention that the intentionality behind what someone did. Now, there's also important to note that there's no expiation for violating fasts outside of Ramadan. So if you were to do a nafil fast, you're not required to feed 64 people or fast 60 days because you broke a fast that you took on yourself. And the reason that's important to note is because, you don't want people thinking that anytime they fast, like if you fast Mondays and Thursdays, that if you broke that fast, you're going to all of a sudden now have to go and, free a slave or feed 60 poor people or fast for 60 consecutive days, right? You would just make up that fast. Now, what requires makeup without expiation, right? And there are books of fiqh that will talk about all kinds of different ways that people can put varying kinds of medicines into themselves, right? And we'll get to medicine in a moment. But now, what about those things that require makeup without expiation, right? So the use of a suppository requires a makeup fast. And that's whether it's medicine or not, right? Um, you would still have to do a makeup fast. And when we talk about suppositories, we're talking about any passage that enters your body, right? So if you ever have read Muqtasar al-Quduri in the Hanafi school, you'll find that they're talking about through the anal passage, the vaginal passage, and also if a male were to stick it in the urethra, that would also require a makeup without expiation. Something that's not normally eaten nor used for medicinal purposes, like if someone were to eat dirt for some reason, right? And we're just giving this as an example, or anything that you wouldn't normally eat, like you wouldn't normally eat chapstick. But if you ate chapstick for some reason, you would make up your fast, but there's no expiation. If you are coerced to break your fast, you would also simply make up your fast. And if you were to eat intentionally in the daytime for any fast in which you didn't make the intention before Fajr, now that only applies to fast outside of Ramadan, right? So if you're fasting Mondays and Thursdays and you were to, you know, eat something, even if intentionally, you wouldn't have to you wouldn't have to make expiation for it. You would simply make up your fast. Um, Obviously, we covered intercourse requires you to um, pay an expiation and make up your fast. If someone were to wake up, for instance, they took a nap in the day and they found they had some kind of this applies to men only, of course, like a wet dream, some kind of seminal discharge, and it wasn't because of intercourse. It might have been from, let's say, kissing or touching. If it was due to that, obviously, that's where we start getting into they still have to make it up. If someone pours water into the body cavity of a sleeping person, right? Now, this is very unlikely, but if you were, then obviously you would have to make the day up without expiation. Again, don't pour water into the mouth of a person who's sleeping. That sounds dangerous in itself, but it's covered in the books of fiqh. We also talk about self-induced vomiting, right? So you'll hear sometimes vomiting breaks your fast. And vomiting itself does not break your fast. If you were to throw up on your own for no reason, it does not break your fast, right? But if you make yourself throw up, either by gagging or sticking your fingers down your throat, then that in itself would be considered something that breaks your fast, and you would be required to make up your fast. Now, things that require nothing but are disliked. Oh, things that require nothing and are not disliked. We'll go to that first, right? So this one has a difference of opinion, right? So cupping. If you follow the Hanafi school, you'll find that cupping or drawing blood, as long as it does not weaken you, it doesn't require anything. If you look at the Hanbali school, you will see that it breaks your fast and the person who did its fast, right? So, while I don't think many people right now are engaging in cupping during the month of Ramadan, because there is that difference of opinion. Yes, if you follow the Hanafi school and you were to have cupping done to you, or you're someone who does cupping, then you could say, look, I'm following the opinion of the Hanafi school. It didn't break my fast. However, because there is an opinion that it breaks your fast and it breaks the fast of the one who does it, it is just better to not do that. And it also is disliked if it does weaken you in Hanafi school. So it would be better to avoid that. You are also allowed, because this requires nothing and is not disliked, to use the toothstick, the siwak, even if it's used at the end of the day. You're obviously allowed to rinse the nose or the mouth, as long as you don't swallow the water. But one thing to note is, if you're doing wudu and you happen to be a small amount of water, you don't have to constantly spit to try to make your mouth dry after you do wudu. There's people who do that. You don't have to do that. If a little bit of water somehow gets into you from rinsing your mouth, that's not the same thing as drinking water, right? You're also allowed to place a wet garment on one's body or take a bath due to heat. Now, there are things that require nothing but are disliked. So, what exactly is disliked? So if you take some food, like if you have food in your mouth and you're chewing on it without swallowing, right? Without a valid excuse, that's disliked. You shouldn't do that. Right now, the only reason you could think that someone would do that is if they're one that's weird. You shouldn't be doing it just because you want to chew on something. But in generally, don't put food in your mouth during when you're fasting, unless, of course, the valid excuse that they're talking about is if you're cooking the meals for people and you have to put a little bit of food to taste it and then spit it out. That's the excuse they're talking about. The thing that they're talking about as being disliked is the person who just like comes up and takes a little bit of food to taste it and then doesn't eat it. Now the other one is to they'll say kissing your wife or your spouse. However, if you feel free from engaging in any further action, then that's not disliked, right? And we now have some actions too that are recommended for the one fasting. Obviously, eating suhoor is recommended because there's blessing in it, even if it's only a sip of water. Um, and you should delay your suhoor until shortly before Fajr, while making certain not to, eat anything after Fajr enters. And of course, last year we went into a whole discussion of when is Fajr, and of course, to hasten breaking one's fast. Right, so you would want to break your fast as soon as possible, right? So some masjids, you'll see people sitting there and like everyone's phone has the Adhan app on it and they're all going off and they're being told, no, 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 wait, wait, wait. And 1 or 2 minutes go by and then they call the Adhan and they're like, that's the Adhan. Now we'll break our fast. It's not out of caution to start your fast early, and it's not out of caution to break your fast late. That's against the sunnahs. We know there are many hadith that talk about how the Prophet would tell people to continue eating until it was certain that Fajr time came in all the way, and to stop eating as soon as they had their first indication that it was Maghrib time, right? So you'll see some masjids, they have the time of ending fasting at the time that um, Fajr begins. You'll see some will put like a minute before, and then you'll see some masjids do something very curious. They use the later time for Fajr in order to start the prayer, and they won't pray before the later time. However, they tell people to stop eating at the earlier time. And you have to ask yourself, if Fajr time actually started at the earlier time, why are you waiting until after the later time to begin the prayer? Right? It's because they're trying to put a margin of safety in. And again, there is no margin of safety. Now, what about the people who are exempt from fasting? Because remember, we said if you do these things intentionally, some of them you have to pay a penalty, either freeing a slave, fasting for 60 consecutive days, or feeding 60 poor people per day, right? So someone that just had no excuse and they just decided that they were going to eat during the month of Ramadan or have intercourse during the month of Ramadan, every single day that they did that, they would owe a slave, feeding 64 people, or fasting 60 consecutive days, right? So who is allowed to break their fast and not have to worry about that penalty? And who's allowed to do things that would normally cause them to have to make up their fast and not have to pay that penalty? And remember, that penalty, it's 60 consecutive days in addition to the days you missed, right? So if you miss 30 days of Ramadan, you have to fast to make up those 30 days and fast 60 days for each day you missed, or pay to feed 64 people. Now, normally, a person should, if there's a person who, well, we'll go first with what do you do if you didn't have to fast and now you have to fast, right? So a lot of schools will say you fast the next day. Some schools will say you fast starting from when it's obligatory for you to fast. So if you, let's say the middle of the day passed, and what we're going to talk about here is the following people. For instance, if a traveler arrives to their place of residence and was not fasting on a journey, right? If a woman is menstruating or has postnatal bleeding and that stops. If a non-Muslim embraces Islam, or if a child becomes an adult, either by age or puberty. And let's say they weren't fasting, obviously, right? What do they do? And the answer is, you could say that, they wouldn't necessarily have to start their fast immediately that day, right? They could go ahead and start their fast the next day. There's another opinion that says they would start their, if it was before midday, they would start their fast. If it was after midday, they just wouldn't fast that day, right? And of course, a person who was traveling and arrives at their place of residence, or a woman who goes from a state of impurity to purity, that case may require a makeup, depending on the school that's being followed. And of course, the last two, if a non-Muslim embraces Islam or a child becomes an adult, that does not require a makeup fast for them in any school. So who's exempted from the fast? So if you are sick, right? And this is the one most people know of. If you are sick and you fear, right? Now you'll oftentimes hear this described as if you go to a believing doctor and the believing doctor fears that your sickness will become worse, right? It actually doesn't require you to go to a doctor who tells you your illness will become worse, right? Obviously, if you go to a doctor, a medical professional who says fasting will make your condition worse, then you obviously should not fast. But a person who they themselves fear that the illness will worsen, that person does not have to fast, right? And if it's something temporary, like you're feeling sick, you feel like you need the strength to fight off the sickness, or you have some kind of medical condition that is temporary that's preventing you from fasting, and this could be anything from a physical health or a mental health condition as well. You'll find if you talk with psychiatrists, a lot of times people who have hormone imbalances or other kinds of chemical imbalances in their brain, that they have to be on a specific schedule and a specific dietary schedule. And if that's the case too, and your condition would worsen because of it, then you obviously don't fast. If it's something that's expected to go away, right? Like you have the flu, you have COVID, you have a cold, your condition is time bound in some way, then you would just make up those fasts once you're better. If it's not expected to go away, it's something more permanent, then you would pay for one poor person to eat. So you'd pay the amount of zakat al-fitr every single day, for instance, for the month of Ramadan. So again, if it's 30 days, and let's say it's $10 a day, you'd pay $300, or if it's $5 a day, you'd pay $150. Now, a little thing a lot of people don't realize is you don't have to pay that in your own community necessarily. If you have family in another country, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, wherever, and you find that it's cheaper to feed 30 poor people there, then you would feed those people. The next person that's exempt is a pregnant woman or a nursing mother. Now, some schools will say unconditionally they don't have to fast. They just make up their fast later. Other schools would say they'd have to have a legitimate fear that their fasting could harm the baby or the quality of their breast milk, and that would affect the nutrition of the baby, right? So again, if you ask a doctor, will my fasting affect the baby's health? and they say, no, it won't. Okay, you can go off of that opinion if you'd like, but just know that a pregnant woman, a nursing mother, they're not required to fast. And this, of course, is because the baby has a right on their mother, and they have the ability to say, well, the baby can't talk, obviously, but they have the rights to the mother providing them with nutrition. So they don't have to fast, and they would either make it up. Obviously, pregnancy does not last in your lifetime, so you would just make up your fasts later. Now, someone who undergoes severe thirst in which they fear death or bodily harm, right? Now, when we talk about this one, you're a lot of times talking about people who work outside or work in a field that requires a lot of physical labor or mental concentration, right? So the traditional background on that one is people would say, okay, a laborer who's outside working in like a brick kiln or working in a bakery or somewhere where there's high heat and, flying a small plane, or it could get like 100 degrees in the little plane because there's no air conditioning. Anything you do that can involve a lot of heat and could cause you to become ill because you're not able to drink or lose concentration. Now, there's a difference of opinion on this next one, which is someone who requires mental concentration to do their job, and fasting prevents them from doing it, especially when their job involves safety of another. So we're talking about like a surgeon, right? If you're a surgeon and you fast and it causes you to make mistakes, then you cannot fast on the days that you're performing surgery. Why? The people who you're performing surgery on, whether they're Muslims or non-Muslims, they have a right that you perform at your best, right? So if you're making mistakes because you're fasting, you cannot fast. You cannot put other people's lives at risk. You could talk about a pilot flying a plane, for instance. Some of them fast, some of them don't. Generally, pilots take the ruling of a traveler, though, which, if you were to go to Sheikh Google, for instance, and ask the question about pilots fasting, you'll find a lot of times that, they take the ruling of the traveler because they're going from one place to another, usually over great distances. If they're flying like a border patrol mission, for instance, again, they need their concentration. They're going to be out all day in a small little aircraft. Obviously, they wouldn't fast because they don't want to crash the plane. That would harm a lot of other people as well, like the passengers or those who are on that mission with them. Now, of course, leading into that, a traveler also does not have to fast, right? And it is preferable that you'll see some books of fiqh that will say, oh, it's preferable for them to fast, but we know from hadith that it is not preferable for a traveler to fast. Now, if you are a traveler who travels for business purposes and you find yourself traveling all the time and you normally fast Mondays and Thursdays and the middle days, and you find that fasting doesn't actually affect you when you travel, go ahead. You can fast. But for the average person, you shouldn't fast when you're traveling. You just make that up later. So we can also get into, obviously, fidya, which we covered, which is if you're not going to be able to fast, you pay a certain amount, and either monetary value or feeding a poor person for each day you couldn't fast. Another kind of person that's exempt from fasting is when we talk about old people. Now, older people are taking the ruling of a sick person in a way, because, again, you'll find 80 or 90-year-olds that fast just fine. And then you'll find 60-year-olds that say, oh, I don't have to fast anymore. I'm old. And they stop, right? When we're talking about elderly, we're not talking about your age chronologically necessarily. I mean, obviously, you would have to be in an advanced age to be considered elderly, but it's not like retirement, not like Social Security. You collected at 62, 65, 67, maybe 70 at the latest. No, it's not like I turned 62, I don't fast anymore. I turned 65, I don't fast anymore. If you are generally healthy like you were throughout most of your life, you can continue to fast, right? But if you find that in your old age you're becoming frail, right? Because remember, old age, if anyone, of course, has been to, like, for instance, Bangladesh, right? A 70-year-old in Bangladesh does not have the same faculties as a 70-year-old in the United States, right? So the frailty will be what stops you from fasting, because you're not going to endanger yourself in order to fast. And that person would pay the fidya as well. So anytime a person who's unable to fast can make up their fast, they make it up later. If their condition doesn't seem to be improving, or it's something that isn't going to go away, like old age or some kind of health condition that isn't going to disappear, again, they would go ahead and they would pay the fidya, right? Now, this question does come up occasionally, and it's about autism, right? So people who are autistic a lot of times, or have autism, a lot of times have to stay on a strict schedule, right? Or else they can't cope. So if someone has something like that as well, and there's a medical condition causing them to be unable to cope if they're not on a schedule, and they find that when they fast, that causes them to get worse, right? They're unable to function. Obviously, they wouldn't fast. They would just pay the fidya at that point. And, when we talk about, again, mental health, we're talking about people who are sane but have mental health issues, right? A person who is not sane, they do not have their faculties about them, they simply don't fast. So when I mention autism in that way, I'm mentioning people who have function, who are functional with autism. Someone who's not functional, they don't have their faculties, they wouldn't be considered a sane adult who has all their faculties, who can make reasonable decisions. That person obviously does not fast. Now, what about, so that's it for fasting, especially because we're only covering the month of Ramadan. We're not going to go into the Nafil fasts unless anyone wants to go into those later, and we can set up another session for that. But just to cover it, there's 4 categories of breaking your fast. There are the things that do not break your fast, the things that do not break your fast but are disliked, which you shouldn't do, obviously, because they usually lead to the things that do break your fast, the things that break your fast that only require a makeup, and the things that break your fast but require a makeup and expiation. So obviously we know that the things that require expiation, there's really only 2 of them, and that is intentionally eating or drinking or intentionally having intercourse. And intercourse in this case, when we look at books of fiqh, it's defined as through either passage. So they're talking about, the haram one and of course the normally halal one. Um, Either way, that breaks your fast, and you have to pay an expiation. If you eat or drink intentionally, expiation. What is expiation? It's freeing a slave. None of us have those right now, so you can obviously not do that. The next one is fasting 60 days consecutively. It cannot include the Eid days, it cannot include Ramadan. And the next one is feeding 60 poor people. This is per day that the person broke their fast, in addition to making up their fast. Now, the reason I mention this again, besides just letting everyone know about that, is because let's say you missed 10 years of fasting. When you were younger, you just didn't care about religion and you just missed a bunch of fasts, right? 10 years worth of fasting, if we do the math, that could be 60 years straight of fasting, not including Eid and Ramadans, right? Let's face it, most of us don't have the ability to do that. And especially if you've been missing fasts already. And if you were to say, let's pay the penalty for it, you could be talking about, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Obviously, most people don't have the ability to do that. So what do you do in that case? Well, there's another ruling, and this ruling comes from Ibn Taymiyyah and is found in certain parts of the Hanbali school. And it generally says that if a person has missed a great number of fasts because there was a period when they weren't practicing, or a period in which they had left the religion to go to another religion, then they don't need to make up those fasts. They just need to have sincere repentance and to never miss a fast again without an excuse. And then, inshallah, if they do that, and they do lots of extra good deeds, Hajj, they do Umrahs, they pray lots of extra prayers, they do a lot of nafil fasts, that inshallah Allah will forgive them for this. And the logic behind this is, if someone has, let's say someone had missed 10 years worth of fasting, right? Because they weren't practicing. And then they came back. It would put them into great despair to think that now they have to expiate for that by fasting for 60 years, basically. In addition to making up, doing their current Ramadans and all the other things they need to do, right? They would just say, what's the use? I'm done. Like, there's no way I can do this. I'm clearly, it's not going to happen, right? And obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful. So you would believe that the person would take the ruling if someone had left Islam because they were not practicing, and you would say that, inshallah Allah will forgive them and they need to just focus on doing better now, right? That's the same ruling with prayers, where do you have to make them up or not make them up? The scholars that say you don't have to make them, or you cannot make them up, they would say the same thing. Look, repent, 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 and do as many things you can, as many good deeds as you can to make up for it, or try to make up for it. And inshallah, the most forgiving will forgive you. Right? Now, obviously, if you missed one Ramadan, try to do your expiation if you can. If you can't, again, we do rely that Allah is the most merciful, and inshallah will forgive you. Now, one last thing, which is in regard to medicine, right? If you have an inhaler, you have asthma or something that requires an inhaler, inhalers do not break your fast. What you're inhaling is going into your lungs, not your stomach. Injections like insulin also does not break your fast, right? Vaccines do not break your fast. Now, there are opinions, of course, that you shouldn't, and maybe they will, but generally the opinion is they do not break your fast. There is an opinion that says that if you need to take oral medication, you'll hear some scholars go to the opinion that if you need to take oral medication, like some kind of tablet or pill, that you just shouldn't fast until you don't need to take it anymore. And then there's the opinion that if you take it with a small sip of water or no water, just whatever is barely the minimum to get that in, then that also wouldn't break your fast. Again, that's a minority opinion. The majority opinion is that you just shouldn't fast if you need to take such medicine on a regular basis. So with that, I'll go ahead and open up for any questions that anyone has, something that they want to know, does this break your fast, or what to do if you were to do something that breaks your fast. So, but just to be clear, only two things require expiation. The other matters that break your fast, intentionally vomiting, for instance, that only requires you to make up your fast. So we'll stop, and I'll also stop the recording on this.